I never told my son I understood Spanish. Not once in 47 years. It wasn't malice that kept me silent, it was love, I suppose. Or maybe just the quiet habit of a mother who learns to hold her tongue. I learned it in secret, you see, long before he was born, back when his father and I were young and the world felt infinite. Carlos, my Carlos, used to whisper to me in Spanish during those honeyed early years of our marriage, sweet nothings he thought I couldn't comprehend, and I'd smile and pretend ignorance while my heart soared with every word. Later, when he was gone, taken too soon by a heart that gave out at 52, I kept studying, kept listening, kept that part of him alive in the privacy of my own mind. It became my secret garden, a place where Carlos still lived, where I could tend to memories in a language that belonged to us alone, even if he never knew I'd learned to speak it fluently. My son Michael grew up bilingual, of course. His father insisted on it, and after Carlos died, Michael clung to Spanish like a lifeline to the parent he'd lost. He'd talk to his abuela on the phone every Sunday in rapid-fire sentences I pretended not to follow, and I'd busy myself in the kitchen, stirring soup that didn't need stirring, just to hear that musical cadence that reminded me so much of my husband. When Michael brought home Elena, beautiful Elena with her dark eyes and quick laugh, I watched them fall into their own private world of Spanish conversations, and I felt happy for him. Truly, I did. She was lovely, gracious, always respectful. They married in a ceremony that made me weep, though everyone assumed I was crying from joy alone. I was crying because Carlos wasn't there to see it, because our son looked so much like him in his wedding suit, because time is a thief that takes and never gives back. The years rolled on the way they do, gentle and unremarkable. I sold the big house, too many echoes, too many rooms that remembered what I was trying to forget, and moved into something smaller, more manageable. Michael and Elena bought a beautiful home across town, all modern lines and enormous windows. They'd have me over for dinner once a week, sometimes twice, and I'd bring dessert and stories and try not to overstay my welcome. I was acutely aware of being the aging mother, the one you love but who can become a burden if you're not careful. So I was careful. I maintained my independence, my small apartment, my routines. I volunteered at the library on Tuesdays. I had my book club on Thursdays. I didn't need much, and I tried not to ask for anything. Then I got sick. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in that insidious way that age brings, a persistent cough that turned into pneumonia, a weakness that settled into my bones and wouldn't leave. The hospital, the medications, the slow realization that living alone might not be safe anymore. Michael suggested I move in with them. Just temporarily, Mom, he said, his hand on mine, his eye sincere. Until you're stronger. We have that whole guest suite downstairs. You'd have your own space, your own bathroom. Please. It would give us peace of mind. Elena nodded beside him, smiling warmly. We'd love to have you, Barbara. Really. And what could I say? I was 73 years old, tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix, and my son was offering me a place in his home. I said yes. I said thank you. I packed my things and moved into their guest suite with its pristine white linens and the faint smell of lavender from the diffuser Elena had thoughtfully placed on the dresser. The first few weeks were pleasant enough. I kept to myself mostly, reading in my room, taking short walks around their neighborhood when I felt strong enough. They were busy people, Michael with his real estate development company, Elena with her interior design business, and I was content to be a quiet presence in their home, unobtrusive as a shadow. We'd have dinner together most evenings, and I'd help with the dishes despite Elena's protests, and afterward I'd retreat downstairs while they watched television or worked on their laptops, their voices a comfortable murmur through the floorboards. It was about a month in when Michael first mentioned the paperwork. We were having dinner. Elena had made this beautiful paella that reminded me achingly of something Carlos used to make, and Michael cleared his throat in that way people do when they're about to discuss something serious. Mom, he said, setting down his fork, Elena and I have been thinking. You're not getting any younger, and we need to make sure everything is in order. Your will, power of attorney, that sort of thing. Just to be safe. He said it so casually, so reasonably. Elena nodded, reaching over to pat my hand. It's really just about protecting you, Barbara. Making sure your wishes are respected if anything ever happens. I felt a small twist in my stomach, but I pushed it away. They were right. weren't they? I was old. These were sensible things to discuss. Of course, I said. We can look into it. But then the papers started appearing with increasing frequency. Documents left on the kitchen counter for me to review. Appointments made with estate lawyers. Michael talking about streamlining my assets and avoiding probate complications. I'd built a modest life, the small nest egg Carlos had left me, our old savings, the money from selling the house. Nothing extravagant, but enough to see me through my final years with dignity. Enough, maybe, to leave a little something behind. Michael kept emphasizing how complicated everything was, how much simpler it would be if certain things were arranged in certain ways. I felt increasingly foggy, whether from the medications or exhaustion or simply age, I couldn't say. I signed some papers. I can't even remember what they all were. Michael would explain them in that patient voice people use with the elderly, and I'd nod and sign where he pointed, trusting him because he was my son, because I'd raised him, because surely he had my best interests at heart. Then came that Tuesday evening. I remember it was Tuesday because I'd missed my library volunteer shift. I'd been feeling particularly weak that day and had spent most of it resting. Elena was making dinner, something that smelled of garlic and tomatoes, and I'd come upstairs earlier than usual, drawn by hunger and by a loneliness that sometimes crept over me in that beautiful guest suite that would never truly be mine. I was standing in the hallway, just outside the kitchen, about to announce myself, when I heard them. They were speaking in Spanish, their voices low but not quite low enough, probably assuming I was still downstairs, probably forgetting that even if I were near, I wouldn't understand anyway. "It's almost done," Michael was saying. "She signed the power of attorney last week, and the new will is ready. Once she signs tomorrow, everything transfers smoothly. The house money, the accounts, all of it." His voice had a quality I'd never heard before, flat, businesslike, discussing me like I was a transaction to close. Elena responded, and I could hear the sound of chopping, her knife against the cutting board keeping rhythm with her words. "And you're sure she doesn't suspect anything? She seems so trusting." Michael laughed, actually laughed, and the sound of it cut through me like glass. "She's old, Elena. She doesn't really understand what she's signing anymore. And she certainly doesn't understand what we're saying right now." I stood there in the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall for support, and felt the world tilt on its axis. Elena spoke again, more quietly now. "I know we need the money for the new properties, but sometimes I feel, I don't know, guilty." There was a pause, the sound of the stove being adjusted. Michael's voice came back harder, colder. "Don't. She's been living off Dad's money for years, sitting on all those assets while we're out here building a real empire. She doesn't need it anymore. She's old, she's sick. How much longer does she really have? A year? 2? And then what would happen to that money anyway? It's smarter this way. We take care of her now, and we secure our future. It's practical." I don't know how long I stood there. It might have been seconds or hours. Time became elastic, meaningless. I thought of Carlos, of the way he used to call Michael Mi Hijo, Mi Orgullo, my son, my pride. I thought of the child I'd raised, the boy I'd comforted through nightmares and skinned knees and heartbreaks. I thought of every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every piece of myself I'd given away with glad hands because that's what mothers do. We give. We give until we're empty, and then we find more to give, and we never expect the bill to come due. I turned around very quietly and walked back downstairs to my room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely close the door. I sat on the edge of that perfectly made bed with its lavender-scented air and I felt something inside me break, not cleanly, like glass, but slowly, like old wood rotting from within. I didn't cry. I was beyond crying. I just sat there in the gathering darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of dinner being prepared above me, of my son and his wife moving through their evening routine, of my life being discussed and dismantled in a language they thought I couldn't comprehend. I didn't go up for dinner that night. Elena came down to check on me, concern painted prettily across her face, and I told her I was too tired, too nauseous. She brought me soup on a tray, even added a little flour in a vase beside the bowl, and I thanked her with a smile that must have looked like something carved from wax. After she left, I poured the soup down the bathroom sink and began to think. You have to understand something about getting old. People start treating you like you're already halfway gone, like you're less than fully human. They talk louder, as if your hearing is failing. They explain simple things, as if your mind is failing. They make decisions for you, as if your will is failing. And if you're not careful, you start to believe them. You start to shuffle instead of walk. You start to accept instead of question. You start to disappear while you're still breathing. But that night, sitting in the darkness of that guest suite, I felt something wake up inside me that I'd thought was long dead. It was rage. Pure, clarifying, beautiful rage. I spent the next day making phone calls from my room, speaking quietly, arranging things. I found a lawyer, not the one Michael had selected, but someone independent, someone who listened when I explained my situation. I was sharper than I'd been in months, adrenaline burning away the fog. I discovered that I hadn't signed away nearly as much as Michael thought. Several key documents were still pending, still required my signature. The timing of my clarity was perhaps the only mercy in this entire miserable situation. By evening, I had a plan. At dinner, I was all gentle smiles and confusion. I asked Michael about the papers he'd mentioned, the ones I needed to sign. His face lit up with something that might have been relief or greed. I couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't bear to parse the expressions of this stranger who wore my son's face. Yes, Mom, actually I have them right here. We can take care of it tonight if you're feeling up to it. He produced a folder, laid out the documents with that patronizing care. Elena sat beside him, her hand on his arm, both of them watching me like wolves watching a lamb. I picked up the pen. I looked at the papers, at the places where they wanted my signature, at the mechanisms of my own erasure. And I looked up at my son, my beautiful boy, mi hijo, and I said, in perfect, flawless Spanish, "Did you really think I never understood?" The color drained from Michael's face so completely he looked like a ghost. Elena gasped, actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The pen fell from my fingers and rolled across the table, the small sound of it enormous in the sudden silence. "Mom," Michael started, but I held up one hand and he stopped, his voice dying in his throat. I continued in Spanish, every word chosen carefully, every syllable weighted with 47 years of hidden understanding. "I have heard every word. Every conversation you thought was private. Every plan you thought was secret. And now I want you to hear me." I switched back to English, because what I had to say next needed to be said in my own tongue, in the language of my heart. "I'm leaving. Tonight. I've already arranged it. And I've changed everything, my will, my power of attorney, all of it. You won't see a single dollar of my money, Michael. Not 1 cent. I'm donating it all to charity. Every last bit of what your father worked for, what we saved together, what I've held on to, it's going to people who actually need it, not to wolves dressed in my son's clothing." Michael found his voice then, desperate, scrambling. "Mom, no, you don't understand. We were just, but I was already standing, already moving toward the stairs, my legs steadier than they'd been in weeks. I understand perfectly," I said without turning around. "I understand that I raised a stranger. I understand that your father would be ashamed. And I understand that I'd rather die alone in a one-room apartment than spend another night under the roof of people who see me as nothing more than an obstacle to their ambitions." I packed my things while they stood in the kitchen. I could hear Elena crying, Michael's voice rising and falling in frantic explanation or justification or whatever story he was trying to tell himself. I didn't care anymore. I called a car. I left. I never went back. I'm living now in a small assisted living apartment. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, paid for by me, controlled by me. I've arranged for everything to go to various charities when I die: children's hospitals, literacy programs, a scholarship fund in Carlos's name. Michael has tried to call, tried to visit. I don't answer. I don't open the door. Some betrayals are simply too complete, too profound to come back from. I think about him sometimes, about the child he was versus the man he became, and I wonder where I went wrong. Or maybe I didn't go wrong, maybe this was always there, dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to bloom into something ugly. I'll never know. What I do know is this: I spent too many years being small, being quiet, being manageable. I kept my knowledge of Spanish secret because it felt like a sacred thing, a connection to the man I loved. But silence has its price. If I'd spoken up years ago, if I'd been louder, bolder, less afraid of taking up space, would things have been different? Maybe. Maybe not. But I'm not silent anymore. And when I go, whenever that day comes, I'll go knowing that I took my life back, that I chose dignity over convenience, that I refused to disappear quietly into the comfortable erasure my own child had planned for me. Some would say I'm bitter. Perhaps I am. But I prefer to think of myself as finally, devastatingly clear-eyed. I see the world as it is, not as I wished it to be. And in that clarity, cold as it may be, there is a kind of terrible peace. My son never knew I understood Spanish, and now he never will understand the mother he lost when he chose his greed over her humanity. That is his burden to carry. Mine is simply to endure these remaining days with whatever grace I can muster, speaking all the languages I know, keeping no more secrets, taking up all the space I need, until this strange and painful story finally reaches its end.